Linux Luddites, episode 94, for the 26th of December, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And a huge welcome to the last Linux Luddites. Now, we announced this at the end of the feedback segment in the last show, but I just want to be clear for anyone who missed it or who listens out of order or what have you. So with that all clear, let's get on to the topics for our end of year show. Now, much like Mike and the Mechanics, we'll be taking a look back over our collective shoulders at the news that made the headlines in 2016, as well as jousting with each other over whose predictions came true and whose fell well short of the mark. Sandwiched between those two segments, rather than your feedback, which was almost exclusively tributes to the show, which was very kind, thank you very much, we'll be feeding forwards about what is on our podcasting horizons. So with that, should we take a look back at the 2016 news?
So Paddy has done a stellar job as usual compiling the news from the last year, but rather than doing it by month and in chronological order, it's more grouped by topic. So let's start with the saddest of topics, the in memoriam section. And the first one was Ian Murdoch, the founder of Debian, who died aged 42, which was actually, he died at the end of 2015, but it was we kind of didn't find out what had happened until very early 2016, and we weren't sure what was going on, but then it turned out that it was a suicide, which was terribly sad.
Yeah, agreed. Obviously, Debian being a bedrock of a number of distributions, not least Ubuntu and all of those derivatives that come after that. So quite a huge a loss for the community. We also lost Richard Sapper, who was the designer of the iconic ThinkPad, and Seymour Papert, although I may have pronounced that wrong, even though we discussed it loads when we were covering it, who was really sort of pushing technology and education. And if you want to look at any more of that information about these three people who were, great losses in 2016, we'll obviously have links to them and their work in the show notes.
Well, let's move it on and talk about something a little bit happier then. And this year also marked the 25th anniversary of Linux itself.
Yeah, I think everyone's heard about this email that came out saying that it wasn't going to be anywhere near as big as GNU or anything, and you then skip forward 25 years and it's arguably bigger than any other of the operating systems that you have if you look at all the servers and what have you. And there's also quite a lot of news from the Red Hat camp, and they were able to announce that they were the first £2 billion open source company.
Dollar.
So dollar, and it does almost makes it one-to-one these days though. And so that's obviously, a really good a show of how much money there can be in open source.
Yeah, something we never really bottomed out on the show, to be honest, was talking around the topic of how you monetize open source software and pay for development. And although people always point to folks like Red Hat, there are plenty of other companies out there really struggling.
Yeah, was it this year that the Elementary project had the download button that automatically had it paid and then you had to press 0 or whatever, and that sort of caused quite a big sort of ruckus in the community, didn't it?
I think that was 2015 when they first did that, but they continued into 2016 with it, and it seems to have calmed down now because you can put 0 in. It's not a huge issue, and people have accepted, I think, that they're trying to make a few quid, and fair play to them.
Yeah, well, rather than paying for Elementary, you could just go and get RHEL as a developer. And this was the other announcement from Red Hat, that if you wanted to, develop on RHEL, and they were then, rather than having to buy it and have the subscription and everything, they would give you a version for free. And so, obviously, that's just trying to pull people in to develop on Red Hat.
Yeah, first they swallowed up CentOS, which is still going, and then they released this free to developers version of RHEL. So it all kind of makes sense that they want people using it, don't they? They want to get them sucked in to using Red Hat one way or another. And then once they've got you, you're going to hopefully stick with them in the long term and pay for support and pay for it in your enterprise.
And they're still not part of Microsoft, which was one of the sort of, not predictions, but one of the comments that Paddy made in our last show about them being bought up. So we'll see if that happens this year.
I think your memory's off there. I think it was Ubuntu and Canonical I was talking about at the time, wasn't it?
No, I'm sure there was some talk about, because at the end of 2015, Microsoft had put some of their people they'd put some of the Red Hat people into the Microsoft camp to work hand in fist. And the problem there was obviously it looked like they were getting closer and closer and chummier. So I think there was a prediction that where Microsoft wanted to just dominate on the enterprise, not necessarily server side, but enterprise desktop solutions, then RHEL is their sort of big competitor.
And I've just skipped ahead in the notes and noticed, no, it wasn't Canonical I was talking about. It was SUSE I was postulating they might buy because they'd got Red Hat over a barrel by way of patent arrangements and such like. So they'd got them tied up in knots. But we're getting a little bit out of sequence here anyhow. Thinking about Canonical, though, I mean, that's really how a lot of people first get started on Linux, and probably one of the reasons why Red Hat went down this route, because you tend to use what you do first use on the desktop, and Ubuntu on the desktop has certainly been a big driver for them for server implementations. But the desktop isn't doing particularly well in the world, and it was partly down to decreasing sales of desktops that Intel announced they were junking 11% of their workforce, and also announced they were killing off some of the Atom chips.
Which isn't a huge surprise, is it, given that the market is just moving to ARM devices? Certainly consumer side of things, and even in enterprise, people are using more iPhones and iPads and that kind of thing. And even in servers now as well, that it's very slowly starting to move that way, that in the data center, you're getting these clusters of ARM chips, and now the 64-bit server suitable chips are becoming available. So it's looking pretty bad for Intel as far as I can see, because they just don't seem to be able to properly compete on the low power side of things, as in electricity power. They're still massively ahead in terms of computing power, especially with the Xeons and stuff like that. But it feels to me only a matter of time before they're going to shrink as a company and potentially in the long term even go bust, basically, as ARM just eats their breakfast, or whatever the phrase is.
Yeah, perhaps going a bit far at the end, but I agree that the Atom chips never had particularly good sort of reputation. They were supposed to be low powered, like say in the battery power type sense, but the balance of having a low power and having low processing power made them not very palatable. Whereas ARM seems to have come from a position where it's incredibly low power and they're very low electrical power, and they're such low computing power, no one really sort of looked at them very much. And now as they've crept up in ability, it's sort of come from, rather than having a reduced good processor, they've got a good bad processor, you know what I mean? It's they've sort of come up rather than fallen down. And so there's a lot more behind them, and they've got all this experience being in phones and tablets and what have you. But when it comes to actual raw grunt, you've got to have an x86 chip. It's got to be, i7s or whatever the newest ones are in the next year or two. I think Intel's, given they have an absolute monopoly on the market, AMD's nowhere to be seen, it's likely they're going to be around for the foreseeable.
Well, it's virtualization, isn't it? Is really where they are going to cling on for the longest, I think, because especially with the Xeon chips, they're really built for it to run loads of virtual machines and containers and all that kind of stuff. Whereas ARM isn't there yet, but I can see, I'm not talking about them going bust in the next year or even maybe 10 years, but I'm just talking much in the long term. I can see if they don't get their act together, and basically if they don't start making a different type of chip, then they're not going to survive, because I just don't think that x86 in the very long term is efficient enough.
Well, maybe they should use some sort of strategy of making chips that go into tablets, because everyone knows that tablet sales is going to save you.
Yeah, the projections are very much that tablet sales will have fallen this year. They are predicted to pick up in a couple of years' time as 2-in-1s become more powerful and actually useful, and will be straight desktop replacements. But for now, they do seem to be dropping off a little bit. But mobile sales continue to impress, and it's a combination of those factors that led to October seeing web access from mobiles surpassing that from desktops for the first time ever.
I mean, again, this was inevitable. We've covered the news stories, 2015 even, the number of people in sort of the BRIC type countries that are getting online, and they're not getting online through conventional computers and laptops and things. It's mobile phones, it's tablets, what have you. And it's just, well, it is inevitable. I think Joe and I would reflect that as well, even as people who have computers already. I know that I use the internet on my phone more and more and more. It's just quicker. It's in your pocket. It's there to go. And I think you're sort of the same, aren't you, Joe?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, it feels almost like the only time I turn my laptops on is to do podcasting these days, really, because if it's just reading and consuming content, then I don't really need to have a full desktop. My phone or my tablet seem to just do the trick for me. And I'm not alone. I know just by talking to people that a lot of them don't use their laptops anymore, hardly. And they have iPads and iPhones, and some of them have Android phones, although you don't see many Android tablets away from the likes of OggCamp or whatever. But I just don't see as many people using proper computers anymore. And as for developing countries, I don't know. I mean, I haven't visited them, but my understanding and from what I've read, you're right, Jesse, that they're getting online, a lot of the people there, for the first time using a phone. And so they've just bypassed the whole proper computer thing. And so it's not a huge surprise, is it, that we've passed this tipping point now? And it kind of, that leads back to the Intel thing. It just seems bad news for them and good news for ARM.
Talking about tablets there reminded me, I was in a meeting the other day and someone had one of these massive Apple tablets. It's absolutely huge. It's like bigger than a sheet of A4. The
iPad Pro, yeah, I saw one of those the other day as well. It is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if he was going to fit in his bag or not. But I mean, he takes it to site and things, and it's just this unwieldy slab. It's absolutely ridiculous.
It would be good for watching old 4:3 TV shows on, because it's not even widescreen, is it? It's the 4:3 ratio, I think, or close to it. But yeah, it is ridiculously big.
It's ridiculously big, and I know this is entirely off, but the stupid thing is that the standard home screen, all they've done is made the icons absolutely massive and spaced them out loads. It's only got like 4x3 or something. It's like a grid of icons. And you think on that screen, if you think of your standard desktop with all the shortcuts and things on it, you could fit like 30 on there without even blinking. It's just the weirdest choice by iOS to just scale up a phone screen to that size. But anyway, we diverge. So getting back to where we are with the news, we were talking about tablets and phones being used more often than computers for access to the internet. And in 2016, Chromebooks had a huge surge and for the first time outsold Macs in the US. And also one of the big announcements from Google was that the Android Play Store would also be available on Chrome OS. And I think it's out in the developer channel at the moment. I'm not sure you can get it as absolutely stock Chrome OS, but it's certainly going to be available very soon into 2017, if not.
I remember reading about it and seeing that my Chromebook wouldn't be supported and losing interest completely. And I haven't heard anything more about it. It seems to be a bit of a back burner thing. Maybe we're going to hear loads about it in the coming year, but it's not exciting to me because, as I say, I can't test it out.
Yeah, I'm in exactly the same boat. I've got the sort of original HP 11 and it also wasn't supported. And I now have a very bare bones Arch install on it because I want it to be snappier than Chrome OS was. So yeah, also can't test it out.
We were talking on a recent show about how long Google provides support for Nexus devices. And I think we all agreed it was a very short amount of time. Well, what's it like with Chromebooks? Because I've obviously never touched one of these things.
Well, mine must be 2 years old, potentially 3. Yeah, maybe 3 years old. And it was definitely getting updates. There's a little sort of auto reboot icon. So it doesn't tell you it's downloading. It doesn't tell you to reboot. It just says when you reboot, it will update. So it's downloads in the background. But so it was definitely getting updates, I assume security, and also I know that the start menu, or whatever menu you want to call it, definitely had sort of a refresh and what have you. So that was getting updates definitely up till a couple of months ago when I flashed it and ripped Chrome OS off it.
Is yours the HP 11, did you say?
Yeah, sort of very white one with like a blue square around the touchpad.
Right, well, I'm looking on Wikipedia, and it seems that both ours were released around the same time, October 2013. And according to Wikipedia, the earliest end of life is going to be November 2018. So about 5 years, which is it's better than Android, but it's not as good as Windows, is it, in terms of support length?
No, it's not too bad, though, because at the end of the day, you could actually go and repurpose those, whereas with phones, the options for putting alternative operating systems on are somewhat limited, aren't they?
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I've got proper Linux running on mine. I haven't used it for a while, actually, but yeah, in theory, that should be supported indefinitely with proper Linux, because you can get CBIOS working on it and actually have control of it. But if a custom ROM is not available for your phone, then you basically can't use it anymore.
Yeah, you're right about the phone side. You know, they're very, very specific as to who has what ROM for what phone. But my Chromebook is an ARM Chromebook, and it doesn't have CBIOS support. So I still have the sort of Chrome bootloader, or the Google bootloader, whatever it is, and you have to press Control-D to say, yes, I know I've messed with my system, and then it boots into Arch. It isn't just a raw, control over everything from the BIOS all the way up. So they're not quite as flexible as the standard sort of x86 machine that, is just Linux when you've overwritten Windows or whatever came on it.
Yeah, Chromebooks have always felt like a halfway house, really, to me, between tablets and phones, that kind of thing, and then proper x86 laptops. But they seem to be doing well, which cannot be said for Steam machines. And I remember there being quite a lot of hype about Steam OS and Steam machines. And then this year, that hype has just died down, hasn't it, with the advance of Windows 10. And it looks like it was just a bet hedge by Valve, and that Steam OS and Steam machines are pretty much dead.
Yeah, something epic is going to have to happen to make them a viable concept again. And I mean, we covered this in the news fairly recently. I think my conclusion there was that the only good thing to come out of this is we now have a very well supported controller for Linux. And there's some random bits of hardware. Oh, there's the clever little Steam pass-on box that will take what your main machine is doing, maybe in your bedroom or your study or something, and then allow you to play it on the TV without having to have that full machine in the TV room. But aside from those clever little things, you're right. I think Valve was worried about what was coming, put some resources into this, but has realised that it's not really going to go anywhere in the future by the looks of it.
Steam Link, I think that's called, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Off a PC running in your study. Is that next to your library?
Yeah, in the West Wing with the server room and stuff.
All right, okay, fair enough. Let's go back to mobile for a minute, and also Internet of Things. And Mozilla announced finally that they were killing off Firefox OS, which is something we'd long been expecting, but they finally came out with an official statement on it. And they also told devs that if they're interested in keeping Boot to Gecko alive, they'd need to fork it themselves.
But they did say that it might be on a TV, possibly, but they weren't going to be doing any of the work on it. It was going to be the manufacturer of the TV, but I don't think we've heard any more about that, have we?
I certainly can't remember anything since CES time, anyway.
We covered this on, I think, the last but one show, but the story has slightly moved on. So it's actually slightly more up to date, and actually breaking news for this show is that we covered the fact that Cyanogen had a bit of a bust up, and one of the original developers has had to leave, and there was some uncertainty as to whether or not Cyanogen Inc. was going to carry on down their path, but he was going to start down afresh. And it looks as though Cyanogen Mod, given that he can't keep the name, is looking at being rebranded as Lineage OS.
You say one of the original developers. His nickname, his sort of online handle is Cyanogen. He's the one who started Cyanogen Mod in the first place, Steve Kondik. And so it's a bit galling, or it must be a bit galling for him to have lost the name that was his in the first place. But that aside, it looks like the fork is going to be called Lineage OS, or possibly Lineage Android Distribution, LAD, L-A-D, but it remains to be seen exactly. I get the feeling we're going to find out about this probably very early next year, and hopefully we can try it out on the new show, which we haven't announced the name of yet, have we?
No, that's coming up in the feedback or even feed forward section.
Feed forward. Oh dear.
Well, back to some slightly sadder news, and this was the year that Linux Voice failed in their crowdfunding attempt for BPPR, which, if you remember, was a book aimed at kids designed to teach them about computing. And later in the year, the team had to fold their publication into Linux Magazine.
I'd never seen that sort of method before where you slim down a magazine and slot it in at the back of the other one. But it works fairly well. I mean, Linux Magazine hasn't lost anything. They're still doing the detail that they originally and always have done. But they've then got Linux Voice, as I say, at the back with some of their more unique features and their sort of take on the Linux world. And of course, the podcast is still going. So that's good news. And also, this year, we saw what I think Paddy thought was a slightly unlikely release of Solus 1.0. Was Evolve OS, was previously before that, probably Solus OS, through some various name changes and stuff. So that's the distribution that Ikey Doherty works on. And they've got the Budgie desktop. We now see there's a Ubuntu Budgie. I know I was listening to another podcast about some of the collaboration that's going on with some of these different distributions. So, all the best to Solus in 2017.
Yeah, Solus seems to be doing well. It's very actively developed and there seems to be a community gathering around it. So it's good to see a complete from scratch Linux distro, something that's not just Ubuntu with the wallpaper changed. So yeah, let's hope that continues to do well. And also in 2016, Jonathan Riddle launched KDE Neon, which is essentially Kubuntu with a more up-to-date version of KDE.
Yeah, I think this threw quite a lot of us, didn't it? Because we weren't expecting him to base anything on Ubuntu itself after, well, given the history between the two.
Yeah, but as he said to us when we spoke to him about it, the fact is Ubuntu is a solid base technically, and although he has a problem with some of the politics there, he's not too stubborn to realize that Ubuntu is technically very good. And as far as he's concerned, the best base on which to build. And so I think fair enough to him for being pragmatic about it rather than stubbornly saying, right, I'm going to go to Debian or I'm going to go and use something else.
It's also nice that this is more of a showcase for what KDE can do or how the KDE folks see it and want it to be sort of shown. So whereas Kubuntu was, KDE enthusiasts molding it in to make it sort of a canonically Ubuntu-y, this is, let's say, the Ubuntu base, but then just KDE applications and just pure the Plasma desktop on top as a showcase for it. Also in 2016, Frank Karliczek left OwnCloud and launched Nextcloud. So we haven't heard a lot from OwnCloud since then, but Nextcloud has released a little box which has a Raspberry Pi in for sort of your own private Nextcloud all built in. There's various updates and releases. They're sort of a bit more vocal. I think this is partly because a lot of the OwnCloud folk were sort of dragged or coerced or moved into Nextcloud, so there's a lot more development going on that side of the fence.
You say a box with a Raspberry Pi in it, a box in which you can put a Raspberry Pi. It comes with just a hard drive. It's basically the Western Digital hard drive in a box thing, and then you plug that into your Raspberry Pi and make your Nextcloud box. And to be fair, they've also had another release recently, Nextcloud 11. So they originally launched with just basically find and replace release, didn't they? Nextcloud 10, which was identical to OwnCloud 10, but now they've got their own Nextcloud 11 with new stuff going on. Although we've never been massively impressed with it, have we? I suppose it would have been on the agenda to check it out, but perhaps we can do that in the new show.
Well, moving away from projects and actual bits of software you can touch and play with, obviously legal matters are quite often at the forefront in the open source world. Free and open source world, sorry, I have to get that in there. And that was very much the case in 2016. And we're kicking off by talking about Canonical and their decision to ship ZFS with 1604. And as you'd expect, that raised quite a bit of a stink with the FSF, Software Freedom Conservancy. And a little bit later, the Software Freedom Law Centre, I think, sum things up in a far more rational vein. And despite all the sort of cries at the time, very little has happened since then. And I can't think any legal actions proceeded, whereas there are obviously threats from various parts of the community that it would happen at the time.
I'm amazed there wasn't. I thought this was going to be something that the FSF really picked up on and made an example of Canonical. But they sort of slipped it in and said, our legal team has looked at it and we don't think it's a problem. So here it is. And it's still there, and they're still publishing releases with it in. And they say nothing's come of it. I'm really surprised that ZFS wasn't in Linux for years and years and years because of the legal wranglings. And Canonical just went and threw it in, and it's sort of stuck. I think it's a very strange position, but at least this means there's ZFS in mainstream distributions, which is a huge draw because that was always one of the big bonuses of going over to BSD.
But when it comes to legal issues like this, the wheels turn very slowly, don't they? And so that begs the question, here we are, 8 months on from the release of 1604. Is it too late? Have they got away with it, if there is indeed something to get away with? Have they got away without a legal challenge, let's put it that way? Or could this still be coming?
Well, as far as I remember, that was one of the things that was brought up in the Software Freedom Law Centre's blog post at the time, was that if nobody challenges, then although technically you may still be in breach, there's sort of an acceptance there by the community that there is no problem with this, and that makes it a lot harder to pursue action further down the road. So you would have thought something would have happened by now. So maybe they just can't round up enough kernel developers to get excited about this.
Well, that brings us nicely to the next one. And that was the brouhaha, I suppose you would call it, on the Kernel Summit mailing list. And that started with Karen Sandler suggesting that at the Kernel Summit they might have a discussion about GPL enforcement. And it kicked off. It kicked off big time, is the only way to describe it, with an incredibly long mailing list discussion, with some people being very pro-enforcement, and some people saying that it was just litigious nonsense and we need to find other ways to solve these problems and not resort to taking it to court, because as soon as you start taking it to court, everybody loses, basically.
Yeah, I remember there was some strong views on the other side as well about if you have these large companies, they often don't hear the voices, if you're just saying, oh, please, please, please. Whereas if you bring some sort of litigation, show them the lawyers, and they go, oh, okay, we speak that language. We understand where you're coming from. Let's move it this way. So there were as many sort of cases of someone doing what you wanted them to do because you'd asked them nicely, as there were someone doing what you wanted them to do because you'd thrown a lawyer in their direction. So it very much comes down to what your view is on litigation and enforcement of the GPL.
Yeah, I think it was an important thread, to be honest, and will probably be referred back to in future years, because it did pull out, it did tease out all the arguments on both sides, and also where various people stood on those issues, which I think helps everybody to have a firm grasp of what the arguments are and also where people are looking at them from. So it didn't actually resolve anything, but it was a good summary of where we stand today. But clearly one of the developers who feels he has a need to take things to the courts is Christoph Hellwig, and he pursued VMware, and we talked about this a lot earlier in the year, and the courts ended up throwing his case out. He seems to have thought that if he just said they've infringed on me without actually giving them any details, the courts would go away and do all the legwork, and the courts seem to take a fairly dim view of this. He has announced that he was going to appeal this decision, but I guess that's something we'll find out more about in 2017.
Yeah, the case wasn't dismissed because he's wrong. It was just because of the lack of preparation that he had undertaken going into it. So I think there's a reasonable chance that he could win the case if he's more prepared for his appeal. So we'll have to keep an eye on that.
But it was very few lines of code that he was suggesting had been lifted, shall we say.
Yeah, but I remember at the time me saying, well, it doesn't really matter how much of your copyright has been infringed as long as some of it has.
Go on then, explain the big one to me. It's exactly the same case, Oracle and Google going head to head, and Google somehow won, even though it was blatantly obvious that a fair amount of code had been lifted.
Well, they used the fair use defense and got away with it. I suspect because they had better lawyers than Oracle did.
Yeah, it can't have helped that there was an activist judge hearing the case as well who had previously ruled on fair use. I was gobsmacked at the time, and I'm not backed away from the opinion as I had then, which is it was the wrong decision, and no matter how much we may all dislike Oracle, they really ought to have won it, and I can't see them losing this on appeal.
So if Oracle does win, and therefore Google loses, we're talking about Java APIs in Android here. That is going to be extremely bad news for them. They're going to have to do a lot of rewriting of Android.
Or at least the API level, yeah.
Well, I'm sure they'll just lawyer up even harder next time.
Okay, so moving away from lawyers and legal entities and what have you, and we're back into good old solid packaging and the various new ways in which you can deploy software and things on your Linux box. And it's funny because some of these I'm reading and thinking, oh, there's a prediction was made about this or a prediction was made about that. I will keep stum until the prediction segment, but I'm going to lead on this one, unsurprisingly. So this is the Canonical announced Snaps and the Snappy Store and Snapcraft and all the things that are sort of snappy about it. There's also from the GNOME team the Flatpak distribution method, and both of these are entirely containerized apps that you download, and they have all of the dependencies and stuff within one package. And then it means that if someone's, wants to have certain libraries for one particular bit of software and then different libraries under the same name for a second piece of software, different versions or what have you, then you can have them both installed in your system at once. And at the moment, entirely sort of arbitrarily, I would say that sort of Snaps has got the lead on Flatpak. They seem to be pushing forward faster. You can also deploy them not just on Ubuntu, but also on Arch and Fedora and things like this.
Well, that's the key issue here, isn't it? That Shuttleworth spent a lot of money flying in. I think it was in Germany they had this get-together, flying in Ubuntu people, but also people from other distros as well, and giving them, well, they had a week, I think, and giving them the sales pitch, basically, brainwashing, perhaps. Well, that's an outrageous thing to say, but explaining the benefits of Snaps. And it seems that that was a very politically wise thing to do if you want your standard to become the standard. Because Flatpak, you don't hear very much about. It doesn't seem to be progressing at the same rate as Snaps.
Yeah, I think that GNOME are going through the process of building a new software store or app center, whatever you want to call it, that allows you to install both standard packaged applications and also these Flatpaks. And so maybe when that comes out, there'll be a new push, because the GNOME is used across distributions, and if you can have it install just with the GNOME stack, then you've got a possibility of being, outdoing Ubuntu. But as you say, at the moment, it seems like Snaps is sort of in the lead, if you will. Although we did have that news story on the last show about the fact that Snaps are now going to have dependencies, and it seems like a very odd direction to go in.
Well, except that in the last week or so since we recorded, I have been learning a bit more about this, and Campbell Barton left us a comment saying that it's more about predictable dependencies, because you can predict which version of the libraries that you need are going to be in another snap. And I'm starting to swing around, I must say, to the idea of snaps, because I hear that they are much easier to package. They've got the benefit of transactional updates, cross-platform. It does make more sense than Debs in some ways, but I think that it is very early on. I've had 20 years of Debs, whereas we've only had less than a year of Snaps. So it's early, but I think that it does have a lot of potential.
It is early, and I think we're sort of in danger of forgetting that when all this kicked off earlier in the year, I mean, both Flatpaks and Snaps were sort of half-assed systems, to put it rather crudely. I mean, things like sandboxing wasn't available in Flatpaks as far as I remember when they came out. And all the news articles at the time were Canonical had announced this Snappy type system, and that put everybody's nose out of joint because they'd been waiting for flat packs for a while, and so they announced theirs a couple of weeks later, so they didn't lose the momentum. But it was kind of like one technology pushing another, and that's great because it means that everything moves along a little bit quicker and what have you. But to say they're finished, either of them at this stage, I think is a little bit optimistic.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't think that they're ready for mainstream use yet. I know a lot of the people working on snaps would argue against that, and they'd argue for the fact that they are ready for mainstream use. But for me, I'm glad that there are people testing it so that I don't have to. I can stay on my LTS and not use any snaps for now. And maybe in a few more years, we'll be all using snaps and everything will be brilliant.
Yeah, we'll all be installing snaps and then it'll be converging between our tablet and our PC and everything. Will be a rosy future. Talking about the future and how you can plan for it, GNOME realised that actually having GTK3 and it sometimes being stable and sometimes being upgraded, and developers having to constantly chase and upgrade their systems that rely on GTK was confusing people, and I get the impression it was becoming quite difficult. So what the GNOME Foundation did was they said, right, this is how we're going to be doing our upgrade path for GTK4. So we're going to make a stable GTK3, 4.0, 4.2, there's some sort of weird even numbering system, will be unstable. And then when the GTK4 is stable and finalized, everyone can move over from GTK3 and it won't change. So they've brought out, they've released both the cadence at which they will be doing their new GTK upgrades from 4 to 4.2, etc., and then also some sort of information as to when you should move. So just to get some predictability into their release cycles.
Now, I remember being very confused when I read about this in the first place and finally getting my head around it in time to talk about it on the show. And then I saw you'd put it in the notes, Paddy, and I thought, my life is too short to understand this again.
Yeah, likewise.
Why can't they just have a simple version system? Just like Ubuntu, you know what's an LTS and what isn't an LTS. And the kernel does that as well. It's not that hard. Why they have to overcomplicate things, I do not know.
And why they have to plan for constant future development, I don't know.
Developers going to develop, Paddy. You know that.
Yeah. Well, let's change topic completely and talk about some of the boards and Internet of things that have been going on this year. And I guess the big event was that in July, it was announced that Japan's SoftBank would buy the UK's ARM holdings for the princely sum of £24 billion.
Now, this is quite a big topic in the UK, has been covered a lot, both politically as to whether or not that's a sensible amount of money, and also the fact that ARM is one of, if not the biggest kind of tech company in the UK, and now we've, lost the sort of heritage of that. But they said they're going to invest, so let's hope they do, and that we keep all the jobs and what have you. But we now move on to the Pine A64, which really pushed through its Kickstarter goal, and they are now planning a sort of low cost, like Linux laptop, also based on the A64.
Yeah, it looks like a Raspberry Pi, doesn't it? Ostensibly, it's a single board computer, but it is more powerful than a Raspberry Pi. And so this laptop should hopefully be quite good, if a little overpriced, I think. Although compared to some of the dumb shells, which are essentially the same chassis as this, which don't come with a computer at all, it's actually quite cheap.
So which is it?
I think that the shells are massively overpriced, and I think that although for what you get and economies of scale and all that kind of stuff, it's not too bad, the Pine 64 laptop, compared to the big brand x86 low power laptops, for a similar price, you're going to get a lot more performance if you install Linux on those, basically.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It was interesting about these laptop shell things because we talked about them a couple of times, well, more than a couple of times throughout the year. And I think we all had fairly high hopes about being able to plug in or preferably do it wirelessly, sort of just rolling up with a phone or a tablet or something and have it all transfer over onto that as a input and output device. And it doesn't seem to have really taken off as much as we thought it would. And I'm wondering if that's partly because Continuum from Microsoft hasn't really gained any traction, and that would have sort of led the market.
Possibly, but I think it's more a case of just slight disappointments. The Next Dock was the first one that I'd heard of, and that was delayed, and now people have got it, and it's very popular in the Pi community. I've heard a lot of those people. Albert, who I used to do the Pi podcast with, has got one. And hearing and reading reviews of it, it just doesn't quite do exactly everything that you would hope it would. Like the keyboard and mouse can't be connected via USB. They have to be connected wirelessly with Bluetooth. And Bluetooth and Linux is just always a nightmare. So I think it's just the fact that no one has come up with a cheap, good example of it that works perfectly. It feels like this is the first generation of these devices. And when we get the second generation, that's probably when I will personally buy into it. And that's when hopefully it'll take off.
And how much do you think we actually need these sort of devices before things like Canonical's vision can become reality? I mean, are they purely reliant on these sort of shells being available to get people to actually go down that route?
It's a tricky one. I think that Canonical, with their Ubuntu Touch convergence stuff, they are seriously looking to get wireless functionality working where it will just work with people's TVs. But I think that you do need this stepping stone. So you're probably right, Paddy, that, yeah, this is important for them. But then again, how much do we need this? Well, how much do we need any of this stuff? Not really. I think you do need some access to the internet to be able to pay bills and interact with the government and stuff. But being able to converge your phone and plug stuff in, it's all very tinkery, isn't it? It's all hobbyist. I can't see this being mainstream for a very long time to come. I don't think that the Continuum thing has got a chance, basically, because normal people are just not interested in this kind of stuff. They just want one thing that works, or maybe two things that work. They're happy with their laptop to do Word documents and stuff, and they're happy with their phone to read the Daily Mail.
Yeah, and you mentioned plugging cables in there, and that sort of brought to mind my experiences with the Pi the first time I got hold of one of those after you'd sent it to me, and that was absolute horror with cables all over the shop, and it's just not a good experience for a user.
Well, that's one of the reasons why they launched the Raspberry Pi 3 with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on board. I think that rings a bell with one of my predictions, so we'll get back to that. And then later in the year, they announced that they'd sold 10 million Pis in total. So things are looking good for them. Despite your criticisms of the Pi 2 and all the cables and stuff, it hasn't diminished their selling power, has it? To sell 10 million is pretty good going for a small company who've got, 20 or 30 people working in their office.
Yes, excellent. And the Pi Zero must have come out either very late in 2015 or early 2016. So they're the two you can get, the 3 and the 0. And they're really aimed at two very different markets, aren't they? There's the 3, which, as you say, has Wi-Fi, has Bluetooth built in, allows you to connect to it in various ways, quad-core. I'm not saying it's fast, but it's certainly the fastest of that type of board. Whereas the Pi Zero goes the exact opposite way. It's £5, and you don't get a normal USB port. You don't get audio out and things like this. It doesn't even have the GPIO pins, but it's very, very low powered and very, very small. So it's good for the hobbyist. So they've sort of, gone for both ends of that hobbyist market. And I don't own a Pi 3 as yet, but I'm sure when I sort of move over to having some sort of very low power server, which is my current aim, it'll be a Pi 3 because they seem to be fast enough for that kind of job.
When you start giving me all my crusty old hardware back.
Yeah, trying to reduce my electricity bill.
Yeah, and also Pi-related this year, we had the release of Pixel Desktop, the excellently timed announcement of that just before the Google Pixel. But let's gloss over that. They have finally made Raspbian look a little bit less terrible and ancient. And towards the end of the year, they also introduced a version of SUSE Linux Enterprise Server for the Pi.
Yeah, specifically for the Pi 3, I think it is, isn't it? It's the only one powerful enough to run things.
Yet another Linux distro available for the Pi. So it does seem to be going from strength to strength. And without making official predictions, I think that 2017 is probably going to be a good year for the Pi Foundation, as 2016 has been.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And we're talking about Pi Zeros there, and obviously sort of similarly competitive, I would say, was the microbit that the BBC's long been talking about getting into the hands of school children all over the land. And they finally did this year. And they also released it to the general public and then later on started selling it worldwide. This is obviously a very low-powered device, and as Jesse was suggesting about the Pi Zero, it doesn't have things like GPIO pins and what have you. I still haven't seen one of these in the flesh. Have either of you two?
Yeah, I've seen them at Raspberry Jams and had a little play with them, but it's not really for me. I mean, I've always been interested in more of the kind of desktop and server stuff, whereas this is firmly for the maker physical computing side of things with the sensors and stuff like that and LEDs. And it's much, much more about the education side, basically learning to program in a very basic way to get those lights to light up and stuff like that. It doesn't have the general purpose computing potential that even a Zero has. I mean, you can, in theory, boot a desktop on the Zero. You're not going to be able to do much with it, but you could, for example, edit text documents or something like that. Whereas with the microbit, it's just not supposed to do any of that stuff.
Yeah, as you said, the Pi Zero runs Linux, so you can SSH into it, you can mess around with commands and what have you. It's going to be a bit slower and a bit less powerful, but it's still a Raspberry Pi with Linux on it. Whereas the BBC Microbit is sort of a step below that. It doesn't have a full operating system. It's all very much program it, upload that program, and then connect the various crocodile clips and sensors and things and let it do it. So you don't quite get that sort of Linux interaction, which I think where it's maybe, like I say, for education and hackers and things, but it's never going to have the same sort of adoption as the Raspberry Pi because it's a different set they're going for, but you don't have the ability to install all the programs that Linux comes with. The Raspberry Pi has that sort of benefit of having that huge back catalogue of software. So rounding off the IoT type microboard type news for the 2016, and also brushing gently with some of Paddy's predictions that came, is the fact that a lot of the IoT devices started getting quite bad press in some of the major publications and things. And the one that really comes to mind is this huge number of IoT devices that hit a DNS server, didn't it? And basically brought that down. And it turned out that all sorts of companies like Twitter and what have you were using this DNS. And so they all went down as well at the same time. So while I don't think anyone's died from that, it certainly is showing that the Internet of Things are so prevalent. They're a real potential DDoS source, especially as there's such poor security on them.
Yeah, I think it's been one of our ongoing complaints throughout the year and expectations that security will never be particularly good on these devices because manufacturers sort of bosh them out, and at the cost point they are and the supported life cycle that they have, you're just not going to get there. And I think that's why a lot of people are sort of pinning their hopes on Google, even though Android might not be the first thing you think of when you're talking about running stuff on low-powered processors and particularly battery-powered devices. I would be very curious to see, or I will be very curious to see, how well Android Things actually works in the real world as opposed to just the little play environment that we've had with Brillo so far, which is what it was originally called. IoT security is still an ongoing thing, and I see talk of legislation in the States, for instance, addressing this, and it's an issue that's certainly not going to be solved quickly.
Well, you talk about this new Android Things platform, but how long are Google going to support it? We know they've got a history of dropping various things like Reader and, Wave, all sorts of projects that just didn't work out for them. So do you really want to invest too much in the Android Things platform? I'd be reluctant, I must say.
Yeah, I think they're counting on people not having to invest in it particularly, the manufacturers anyway, because it is based on Android and therefore it'd be very easy to port stuff over to it. I mean, people are familiar with the environment, the actual development environment, and also the language. So I think they're counting on that helping them get support from manufacturers. I don't think they're thinking about consumers. I mean, they never think about consumers.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's based on Android, but it's not Android as we know it, is it? It's purely for developers. You're not going to run this Android Things and start playing Angry Birds on it or something like that.
No, there's quite a few of the APIs that won't be available, but an awful lot of them will be, to be fair, which brings me back to my point about sort of the hardware requirements for this and length of battery life and such like. But anyway, it's only been announced in the last sort of couple of weeks, so we'll keep an eye on that, as they say. Oh, we won't know. You will keep an eye on that, won't you, going forwards?
Well, I'm sure you will be keeping an eye on it in your dusty office. And so we move on to why I don't use Linux Mint anymore in the security section. And I think it was quite early on in 2016 that Linux Mint's website was compromised and one of the ISOs or a number of the ISOs were replaced. And we soon realized that they weren't using proper SHA-256 sums. They were using MD5, I think, or was it SHA-1? Either way, it wasn't brilliantly secure. And that just shone a very large light for me on Linux Mint and their security practices. And it led me to look into the whole distro and how I'm just not very impressed with how it's been put together, to be honest. And so I have moved away from using it. I'd kind of started to move away anyway, and I'd always found it a little bit bloated. But I do like cinnamon, so it's been tricky. But anyway, that was the first story, and also FOSS was compromised as well, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. They had some bits of software replaced. Not particularly dangerous things. I mean, all they did was rewrite the master boot record, which sort of anyone who knew what they were doing could get out of. Yeah, but vulnerability in websites was certainly an issue this year that got a fair amount of attention. As did stage fright again. I mean, that was the big story from last summer. And it also reared its ugly head again this summer with another exploit appearing in the wild and millions of Android users potentially being vulnerable to it.
And continuing to be vulnerable as we speak because they haven't had an update.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole issue around media and how media is dealt with has also gotten the press in the last few weeks again because GStreamer has been shown to have multiple holes and Linux desktops, whether it's the latest Fedora or the latest Ubuntu, can be very easily compromised via GStreamer. So how media is actually dealt with, full stop, is still an ongoing issue as far as I can see.
But just to clarify, what I meant there was the people who are stuck on old versions of Android because their OEM hasn't updated them or their carrier hasn't updated them. But if you're running a Nexus device, then it got patched mostly, didn't it?
It did, and I'm sure the desktop issue that I was talking about with GStreamer will be dealt with in a similarly speedy manner. But I don't know. I mean, it's the usual thing about what do you do with devices when they are out of support, and that was kind of one of the reasons why I brought it up earlier when we were talking about Chromebooks and what have you, because it is just a perennial problem within the industry.
Yeah, also, Joe, you seem to be blaming the OEM there and the carriers and what have you, but even if you've got a Nexus device, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get these updates, because if you've got a Nexus 4, for example, that's outside of support. Anything previous to that is outside. You know, Samsung Galaxy S3s, S4s are probably outside of support because Google aren't updating things which are running, you know, H&I, honeycomb ice cream sandwich, or what have you. You have to be in the latest 2 years or whatever it is, even if you've got a Nexus device.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very large problem that we've talked about a lot over the years of doing this show, isn't it? That compare a phone or a tablet to a desktop computer or a laptop, and the support is just totally different. You're lucky to get a couple of years with mobile because you're expected to just chuck it away and buy another one.
Well, whether you do chuck it away or not, there was some good news on the security and privacy front this year when WhatsApp rolled out end-to-end encryption. And although a lot of tech-oriented people don't tend to use WhatsApp, no matter what mega-slippers may think, it is a massive deal, this, or it was a massive deal at the time. It had over 1 billion users, and most everyone out there uses WhatsApp. Yeah,
but colour me cynical for a change. How do we know that it really is properly encrypted with no backdoors? Because it is proprietary. The client that you're using is proprietary. So they can make all these claims and say they're using the same stuff as Signal, but do we really know that for sure?
Yeah, and there's also a question around metadata, wasn't there, if you remember, that all wasn't encrypted, and so who you were talking to could still be seen. It was just the actual contents of your conversation. I'm not sure whether the situation's changed much since then, but it certainly gave a shove to other vendors, and we've seen more and more of these end-to-end encryption out of the box from people like Google since then.
Yeah, but again, if it's not all totally open source, can you trust it? And I might sound a bit tinfoil hat there, but it's just like with Apple users, fanboys always go on about how great they are. But if you're running proprietary software, you've got no idea what it's actually doing. But weirdly, Paddy, this is one thing that I remember you being positive about at the time and me probably being negative about, but I know you've very much embraced WhatsApp, so you are quite pleased and you are sort of quite trusting of this end-to-end encryption.
No, not at all. I distrust everybody's. I don't think any encryption is 100% secure. However, I think it's an enormously important thing by way of raising people's awareness of the issue. The fact that something that is used by everybody now says this conversation can be encrypted just gets the idea of encryption in front of everybody and gets them thinking about the privacy. And I think that's, as much as anything, is the huge bonus that's been introduced here.
But does it not make them think about it and then think that it's a done deal and not have to think any more about it?
Yeah, that's probably true, to be fair. I mean, it's a bit like HTTPS and everyone thinking, oh, everything's secure now, even though that's far from the truth.
Is that your way of getting onto your hobby horse, Paddy?
I don't know, perhaps unfair to call it a hobby horse, but it's certainly aggravated me this year. And that's all the shenanigans around Let's Encrypt and WoSign and really how the industry approached this. And yet these guys did do something bad, but they didn't do something like issuing a subordinate root certificate that would allow you to create certificates for any other website out there. I mean, that would be a terrible, horrific sort of activity. And I mean, if you can get banned by Mozilla for doing what WoSign did, I can't imagine what would happen to somebody who did that. Oh, hang on, Mozilla just slapped them on the wrist and let them get on with it. That was a company called TrustWave back in 2012. I mean, the hypocrisy here is staggering, and it has really blood-boiled me for a long time, this. But then again, TrustWave at the time were selling certificates. They weren't in competition with Let's Encrypt, which didn't exist at the time, which happens to be backed by Mozilla. They weren't a Chinese company, so they weren't being urged to come down on them like a ton of bricks because the US is in a trade war with China at the moment. I don't know. The situation is completely different, but I thought how Mozilla approached this with their faux concern for people's security, really quite galling, to be honest. And considering the conflict of interest there with Let's Encrypt, who has seen a massive uptick in use since the only other major free certificate authority has been destroyed basically by Mozilla. I don't know. It made me very angry this year indeed, but it's just how business is done.
Well, at least Mozilla are putting up $500,000 worth of money to audit open source software. So, they're not all bad.
And remind me how much they make every year?
I don't know. How many billion are they getting off Yahoo?
Yeah. Oh, come on. Move it on, Jesse.
Okay. So we go back to Ubuntu for our next story, and that is to do with kernel hotfixing. And there are sort of features and hooks within the kernel that allow you to update the kernel live without requiring a reboot, which obviously for servers is quite a useful feature. You could argue if it's useful or not, and I know which way you two are going to argue, but they were able to implement this in a way that's slightly different from the way that Red Hat and OpenSUSE do their live kernel patching.
Yeah, you can argue as to whether or not you should be live patching the kernel and not rebooting. And as you said, Paddy and I would suggest that it's probably not the best idea. But if you're going to do it, then it seems that with Ubuntu, they have done it the proper way. They have utilized features already in the kernel and not written everything from scratch, which is good to see rather than, as you say, SUSE and Red Hat, who have just done that. They've just written it all from scratch their own way, which seems like a bit of a waste of effort. Why not do it in a kind of as close to a standard way as possible? But you can see why they are so keen to get kernel patching done, because the kernel has had its fair share of security problems, and a lot of those bugs might be in there for up to 5 years before they get patched.
Yeah, this was a story we reported on fairly recently, and I'll again stick a link in the show notes. I mean, there will be links for everything we've talked about here today in the show notes. Yeah, the kernel continues to grow and change, and as that happens, more bugs are introduced, so it's like whack-a-mole, basically. And it was a really interesting story, the fact that these things can hide there for so long. And despite what you were saying about open source a minute ago, Joe, and how you trust that rather than WhatsApp, the fact the bugs are there for so long suggests there aren't many eyes looking at them. And that is one of the big problems we've got in the open source world when we have such a huge code base and it's growing all the time and changing all the time.
Yeah, and that's particularly pronounced in the kernel, isn't it? Because it is esoteric. So few people can look at that code and make head and a tail of it because it's just so complex.
Yeah, the amount of domain knowledge required is quite high in some of these areas, but unless we actually stop developing stuff, and you've already implied people won't, because A, they enjoy doing it, and B, they get paid for it, although I suspect it's the other way around in reality. Yeah, we're just never going to sort of deal with this as an issue. So those bugs in the kernel that were introduced today, they'll pop out in 5 years' time and bite us on the backside. But anyway, I've been making an effort the last few shows to be more positive, so let's continue with that. I've just seen the next story. And accelerated mobile pages. This is Google's efforts to speed up the web for all our benefit. Alternatively, it could be seen as Google's way of taking control over the internet.
Well, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it, this one? Because from a consumer's point of view, I really enjoy AMP sites. They're really fast. There are very few adverts, not that I would see them anyway because I use AdBlock on my phone. But it's very quick. Almost any news story I look at these days is an AMP site, and it's incredibly fast. However, Google is basically forcing people onto AMP, which in of itself is not ideal. And also the huge problem is that because the reason that it's fast is because of the restrictions on what kind of code you can have on there. We're seriously restricting JavaScript, for example. And it means that a lot of adverts simply aren't allowed on AMP sites. A lot of adverts, that is, except for Google's ones. So it could be seen as anti-competitive quite easily, couldn't it? That they're basically forcing all the other ad agencies, which, let's face it, that's what Google is. That's where they make almost all of their money. It's forcing other ad agencies out and creating a virtual monopoly.
Yeah, plus when you've searched for a particular term and the results come up on your phone, like you say, they're very good when they're AMP sites. They're much quicker, so you're more likely to click on them. So the fact they advertise it being an AMP site before you clicked on it means that you're more likely to go there. Google therefore have more control over what the advert's going to be. And there's, some of these big publishers aren't getting the kind of revenue that they would have otherwise got had you gone to their mobile site and they'd have had whatever code they wanted, pop-ups and things. But then it's almost their own fault this has happened because it's become so slow on mobile, because people are using mobile to look at the web. And it's just such a painful experience when there's, a third of it, 2/3 of it is blooming ads and pop-ups and things you don't want to see. And it just takes ages to load. The number of times that I've loaded a page and I'm starting reading the first paragraph and then a thumping great banner ad pops in at the top and the whole page gets shifted down. I have to scroll down to where I was again because it hadn't actually loaded. It was busy downloading this massive, great big advert. So I feel they've this is their comeuppance for having terribly written, overly advertised web pages. Okay, well, I've got that off my chest. Maybe I'll move on to the next one. So we have covered the fact that the Linux Foundation has introduced more and more free courses. So I'm not sure if they are still available for you to go and sign up to now, but these are the sort of courses that introduce you to being sysadmins or using Linux or what have you. And there's a discussion to be had about whether or not there's a benefit in teaching yourself and proving it without having a certificate, or doing one of these courses and having a certificate in your CV. But, it must be a good thing. And if you can get them for free and take a bit of time to do them, it shows a bit of initiative there.
Yeah, most of these courses seem to be introduction to whatever the topic is. And I think that the clear goal is for you to sign up for a paid course that is a more advanced version of it. But you can't knock free, can you? At least you get an introduction. At least you can get a feel for whether or not you actually want to pursue that particular area. And even if that isn't with the Linux Foundation, even if it's with one of the other companies that offers training, at least you've had that free introduction.
Do you know, I can't believe we've got all the way through this look back at 2016 without someone sort of making some snide or negative remark about the Linux Foundation. We seem to have been doing really well, guys.
Well, I don't know if it's negative or not, really. And that is that they stopped individual members voting in the board elections and standing for the board. So it used to be that you could pay $99 for an email address, an @linux.com email address, and also you could then vote in the board elections. And then they decided that they weren't going to do that anymore. You could still get your email address for $99, but that was pretty much it, and you wouldn't have a vote anymore. And that was coincidentally around the time that Karen Sandler wanted to stand to get on the board and push her GPL enforcement agenda, which we talked about briefly earlier with the Kernel Summit mailing list. I mean, that is her agenda, that she's clearly on that side of things, for better or worse. She thinks that GPL enforcement is very important. And so it was a little bit underhanded of the Linux Foundation to sort of slyly change the rules so that she couldn't become a board member. But then again, it's kind of the whole point of the Linux Foundation is to represent the companies who are members of it. And you can't go having GPL enforcement lawsuits against your members, which is pretty much what would have happened if she had got her way. And so that's why they basically did that, it looks like.
Well, touching on large companies' board members there, in 2016, Microsoft became a platinum member of the Linux Foundation, and that requires a substantial amount of money. However, nothing compared to what Microsoft can afford. And 2016 has definitely been a push from Microsoft to, I don't want to say love Linux, but certainly they see the worth of Linux and being compatible with Linux.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word is embrace. They've very much embraced Linux, haven't they? And they've extended their hand as to shake hands with the Linux world. And maybe there's another word in there, but I don't think they're going to have much chance of extinguishing Linux. But they certainly have realized that they need to jump on the Linux train, basically, because they tried to ridicule it with Barmer and everything and calling it a cancer, and that did not work out very well for them. And so now it is in their business interests to adopt Linux and to embrace it, which is what they have been doing this year.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember when we had it on the show about the amount of Azure that is actually running Linux, and was it about a third, as far as I remember?
Yeah, that rings a bell. I think a third.
Yeah, it's obviously very big for them on the cloud at the moment. This year also saw them buying Xamarin, fulfilling Miguel de Gaza's long-held dream of working for Microsoft, rolling out a beta of SQL Server on Linux, and of course, with Canonical's help, actually getting Bash and Ubuntu on Windows working. And as I said on the last show, working very well indeed.
But those last two stories just sort of showed that it's not only trying to get Microsoft products to run on top of Linux, but also get Linux to run on top of Microsoft products, on Windows. It's sort of both ways round. They're really messing or sort of muddying the waters as to where Linux clearly is, where Windows clearly is. And with the push towards containerization, you can really start to see potentially having applications from Linux running on Windows, vice versa, servers based on Linux and all these sorts of things. So it's becoming quite sort of muddled. And I think it's because Linux on the server, an enterprise and what have you, is really, really steaming ahead. And Windows is getting a little bit left behind. So just trying to get a piece of that pie.
Yeah, I think it's also because the operating system level is losing importance. I mean, we spoke about Chromebooks earlier. And really the abstraction away, it's the services that run on top that provide the things that people want to use. People don't care what's underneath the hood. They don't care about Android or Linux or Windows. It's the apps they want to be using and the services that connect all the apps together. And in a way, would it not be no bad thing at all if we end up having this sort of mishmash of operating systems, as long as it's providing the services, obviously with the caveat that they're open services?
Well, I think that is the crux of it, isn't it? Whether or not this stuff is going to be open source or not, and whether or not Microsoft are going to not extinguish, but get deep enough into the Linux world to mix it up with loads of proprietary software and basically undermined the core values that Linux and the whole ecosystem has stood for thus far, and that is that everything is open source, free software. And perhaps that has been the reason why it's never succeeded on the desktop, because Microsoft, with their love of proprietary software, has dominated that. And it worries me to see Microsoft getting so involved with Linux in the one area where it has dominated, and pushing their proprietary stuff on top of Linux. So yeah, Linux is always going to be open source, you would hope, but they're kind of polluting the waters, I suppose. And that is my biggest worry with it.
Yeah, but you're talking there about the openness of source code. I mean, that's the whole definition of open source. And as we've spoken about on the show previously, that really isn't that important. It's the openness of how things talk to each other. It's the ability to get at data and manipulate it, and for that not to be held in proprietary formats. Isn't that the most important thing?
I don't know if it's the most important. I think it is probably equally as important.
I think this does reflect as well the difference in attitude of why people get involved with Linux. Like maybe, 10, 20 years ago, it was because of the freedom aspect, and that meant that people were keen to make sure that things were, GPL software or what have you. Whereas now it's more a nice to have, but the GPL is not that important. So people are using MIT licenses and Apache licenses and things like this, which have various other caveats. But you can, like Joe's saying, it's still sort of open source. It's just there seems to be a bit of a shift in the view, and it hadn't occurred to me until you started talking about, Joe, that it could well muddy the waters as to how much proprietary software or how much software that you can't look under the hood gets into Linux or gets amalgamated in. And even if you can extract the various bits that you need in order to make sure it works with other applications happily, the standards are open, you're still getting a sort of a muddying, whereas at the moment you have still quite a pure open source GPL v2, 2+3, whatever it is, that has come from this original open source and free as in freedom, push that Linux originally had.
Well, when we get to the end of 2017 and look back on that, albeit not on this show, I dread to think what's going to have happened with the Microsoft situation. That's all I can say. On to what would have been the feedback then, as Jesse has said, feed forward, which is some sort of corporate speak anyway. So first of all, thank you very much to everyone who has written to us on Twitter and on website comments and emails saying, no, don't stop doing the show, and thanking us for doing it. It's been very heartwarming to see that we will be missed for that. So thank you everyone for getting in touch. It's been really great. And we are actually recording this show a week earlier than normal, because if we recorded it normally, it would have been Christmas Eve, and that was just not going to work out. So we can thank the people who have donated up to this point, who are Simon Lewis, Adam Maranyuk, and Daniel Asante. It's very much appreciated. And a kind of thanks to the people in the future, if you do decide to kind of buy us a beer, a send-off beer, as it were. And of course, thanks to anyone who's ever donated on PayPal or Flatter, and particularly the monthly supporters, past and present. That was very good to know how much we were getting and how much we could spend on things and servers and all that kind of stuff. And just a reminder that we'll cancel everyone's monthly payments at the end of December. If you haven't done it already, obviously feel free to do that. And Flatter, we're going to close down fairly shortly afterwards as well. And thanks to people who've been buying T-shirts and stuff from the merch shop. You're going to have until the end of January to buy any of that stuff before we pull the shop down. So if you want a memento, then feel free to do that.
Yeah, a huge thank you to everybody. I mean, we have genuinely been touched by the amount of nice feedback we've had, how much the show's obviously meant to folks out there. And as Joe mentioned, everyone who's helped us keep it actually going financially. So again, a massive thank you, guys. It's been a privilege.
That's the worst being the third, and this is always like the only moment I get to have a mushy segment, but it's amazing that we've had so many emails, so many messages on Twitter and on the website, what have you. So appreciate all that, and I'm glad that people have found the show useful and interesting, and I hope funny and informative. And it's brings it home when you get all this this positive feedback. So this isn't so much of a feedback segment, but thank you very much to all those people who've written in. And I'm sorry we can't name you all, but I hope you've all enjoyed listening, whether you've got in contact with us or not.
And so on to the announcement then. So as you know, Paddy doesn't have time to do this anymore. His work circumstances have changed, and so that's the end of him for this show, and we thought the end of this show. So Jesse and I are going to continue, and the show is going to be called Late Night Linux. And as the name suggests, it is going to be not safe for work. We've decided to get rid of the artificial constraint of not being able to say certain words, so it's going to be free. We're going to try not to swear every second word, but we'll see how that works out. And it's not going to be just you and me, is it, Jesse?
No, we have reached out to a couple of guys that we have had on the show previously, and those two will be Ikey Doherty, who we mentioned earlier is developing Solus OS, and also Félim Whiteley, who we had on the show, and he was discussing his use of Android phones, but without using all of the Google services and their sort of closed down system that Google insists you have. So it's going to be a good range of voices and people. And obviously, Ikey uses Solus, and Félim is a KDE guy, and I'm using Arch and GNOME, and Joe is, I assume, still on Ubuntu.
Yeah, still on Ubuntu. So we should have quite a range there, as you say. And most importantly, they're both EU citizens, Paddy, unlike you. So we should have a nice EU loving there.
Okay, Late Night Linux, you said. So what's the URL?
latenightlinux.com. And that is night spelt correctly. I have also bought night spelt NITE, and I'm hoping to get that forwarding correctly. That's sort of half working at the moment. And there's going to be an OGG feed and an MP3 feed. And I say there is, those things exist, and the site is there and all working perfectly by the time you hear this. Because, as I said, we're a week ago when we're recording this. So yeah, latenightlinux.com, and you'll be able to subscribe in advance to the show. And as for when the first release is, we are hoping, fingers crossed, that it is going to be on the 10th of January. So that will effectively be 1 day later than Linux Luddites 95 would have been. So we're basically hoping for continuity of service here. Very little downtime.
So you mentioned the personnel there, but I guess with a different mix, it's also going to have a different feel.
Yeah, we'll probably be covering a lot of the same topics, but I think it is going to have a different feel to this show. As you say, with different people, it's just bound to happen. And I think there might be a little bit less structure with it. Rather than having defined sections, we might kind of jump about a bit more. But that all remains to be seen. When you start a new show, it takes a little while for the format to kind of evolve. I know that when we started this, Paddy, when it was just you and I, it was quite different from how we've ended up here. So we'll have to see about that. But it's going to be about the same topics. So hopefully everyone listening to this will enjoy the new show, Late Night Linux. And so on to our 2016 predictions. So back on episode 69, we all came up with a few predictions each as to what was going to happen in 2016. And I seem to recall being previously quite smug about my predictions coming true. I'm not quite sure how well they will have done this year, but we'll soon see. So should we start with Paddy's first one then?
Yeah, and that was that there still won't be an official Google native Drive client for Linux.
I haven't got a little bell here, or so I can ring it.
Well, that was pretty obvious, wasn't it, that they weren't going to do that. And here we are, there still is no native client, is there, for Drive. There are a few third-party ones, aren't there, but nothing official from Google.
No, nothing official. And I guess it was kind of expected, really, that this wasn't going to happen. But equally, it's immensely disappointing considering how much value that Linux provides Google as an ecosystem. I mean, you'd understand if Microsoft didn't provide a native client for OneDrive or something, but for Google not to make the small amount of effort needed here to look after the people that are looking after them, I still feel is pretty appalling.
Yeah, I mean, when I moved over to Linux, there was already a Dropbox client, so it was just absolutely normal that you install Dropbox and off you go. I've since mostly moved over to Drive, but I just use it just through the web interface. However, I'd like to point out there are some alternatives. There's InSync, which does require, I think it's an upfront cost or might be a subscription. There's rclone, G Drive, one called Drive as well, and they're all mostly kind of basically sync options through the terminal. But Win for GNOME, because you can add Google as one of your online accounts, and then you can actually use Drive through Nautilus straight into the file manager. So that's quite a seamless integration there.
Well, I think there's no way that I can spin that as a lose for Paddy. So well done. One point. Not that we're keeping score.
No, we are keeping score because my prediction was up next, and this is, I think, the only one that I've got. So my prediction was that you'll be able to install snaps on a standard install of Ubuntu, and if you've followed Ubuntu or us or snaps at all, you'll know that can be done, and you can do it today. You could do it months ago, in fact, and so I think that is a win for me.
And I think more to the point.
Yeah, more to the point, if you go back and listen, no one's going to bother going to listen to 69. I thought, yeah, it's definitely going to happen as well, didn't I? So.
I insist that people go back and listen because Joe definitely was unconvinced and said this is not going to happen. So not only do I feel like I've won, but I've got like 2 up almost on Joe.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, if you thought those two were fairly obvious, let's move on to Joe's first prediction here. A new Raspberry Pi model with built-in Wi-Fi and possibly 4 or 8 gigabytes of internal storage. Did anyone see that coming?
Well, I did.
Yeah, your prediction was originally a new Raspberry Pi. Yeah, that was it.
To nail you down to get the specs.
Well, I got it almost right, apart from the internal storage. I said built-in Wi-Fi, and no one knew that was actually going to happen. And even when I went up to Pi Towers, I was still somewhat surprised when they put that in my hand and said, here you go, it's a Raspberry Pi 3, and it's got Wi-Fi on it. It was everyone's wish list that they wanted Wi-Fi built in, but the fact that they actually delivered it, I think, well, I don't know. Did you really expect it to happen, or is it just with the benefit of hindsight?
I think it was inevitable that a new Raspberry Pi would come out. However, I wasn't so sure about the Wi-Fi, but I did listen back, obviously, to our prediction show, and I moaned so much about the fact that you have to get the right dongle, a compatible dongle, and there's like a list of approved USB dongles for Wi-Fi and what have you, and it just seemed like a stupid position to be in, given that lots of people want these to be battery powered and therefore wireless, from power and from internet. So it seemed like a really sensible step forwards. I mean, at no point do we mention Bluetooth, but that's also been included on the Raspberry Pi 3. So they've gone above and beyond from the I don't want to say Wi-Fi ability, or for cableless interaction.
Go on then, we're going to give it to him.
Oh yeah, there's no way we can argue this one, I don't think.
Okay, so that's 1 each, apart from the fact Joe was wrong about snaps, so we'll have to take the point off there. So 1 for me and Jesse, and still kicking 0.
Yeah.
Excellent. I like this scoring system.
Yeah, I don't so much now. Mind you, I didn't get this one totally wrong. I said that somebody will die as a result of an Internet of Things hack, but I did sort of cover my backside a little bit and said maybe in a year or two's time. Not necessarily this, it would be this year. And it hasn't been this year. I'm actually quite surprised about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest Internet of Things incident was that one that we covered in the news where there was the huge DDoS attack, but it didn't actually kill anyone. I mean, it impacted people to a point where the mainstream press noticed it, and people then realized, well, maybe they haven't realized yet, but it's more of a talking point about how this can be problematic. But there hasn't been a tabloid story about someone's bath being overheated or their car driving off or whatever it might be. I even did a search before we did this with Internet of Things death, and there was absolutely nothing. It was all about how Internet of Things, the concept, might die rather than someone having died. So, I mean, let's be honest, this is a good news story that everyone saw through 2016 without Internet of Things getting in their way. But as I said when we did the previous predictions, or when we made these predictions, the number of devices and the number of people in the world means that at some point those two things will collide. I think it's inevitable.
hang on a second, you've just jogged my memory there. Does a Tesla car count as Internet of Things? It kind of does almost, doesn't it? The self-driving car that crashed and the fella died. So that wasn't due to a hack, though. That was just due to failure. But it was, you could almost spin that as a win, Paddy, if you really tried hard enough.
Yeah, thank you for trying, but no, it was explicitly a hack I was talking about, because I can see this as a way for people to do extremely nefarious things, to use one of Jesse's favourite words in the world.
Yeah, okay, well, fair enough. No win for you there then. So Jesse's next one was an unknown company will bring out and deliver a converged device via a crowdfunding platform before the big players, and he said in that case, including Canonical, shipped anything. And Paddy, you thought that Canonical would release something and it would flop, and that they'd be out of the phone business altogether by the end of next year. A lot to digest there. The kind of given there that was that we would get a properly converged device. Now, does the M10 tablet count?
I think it does. It doesn't matter what the state of Ubuntu Touch is that we talked about recently, but I think it certainly counts.
Right. Well, in which case, yeah, I suppose you were right there, Paddy, that it came out and flopped. And Jesse, you were wrong. I don't know. I mean, you're going to try and spin Maro OS. I see you putting that hastily into the notes here.
Yeah, I thought I'd drop my bomb into the show notes. So I couldn't quite find something that matched my exact words. Whether or not you mean that, you take that as that I've lost. But there's Nextdoc, which I think we mentioned in the news. It's not Linux, but it is a sort of a convergent type device. I'm not convinced by that.
It's more of a vessel, isn't it? It's more of a convergent vessel for a device to funnel its convergence through.
Yeah, exactly. There's UB ports, which I think is not released yet. So the problem was that I said it had to be in people's hands. We didn't agree that you could have something on Kickstarter announced but not delivered. I believe this is still going through the delivery process. So this is for Ubuntu Touch. It's a little sort of puck that you put on your desk, and you can use that to talk to your phone and then talk to your PC. And I'm going to flag up Maru OS because, I mean, we talked about it. I know you loved it, Joe. I thought if anything's going to sway you, it's going to be Maru. But I agree that that's not really convergence either. That's just having a desktop on your phone, which is not the sort of convergent view that we were looking for or that has been sold to us by Canonical.
No, and it's a work in progress as well. I'm very impressed with it because it's not being touted as a working consumer product. It's a work in progress. We had Preetam on the show this year to talk about it, and I'm very impressed with it as a kind of as a development and as a project, and I think it's got massive potential to be able to have Android and a proper Debian computer that you can do. I mean, I shot, edited, and published a video to YouTube on it using OpenShot as the editor there. It is a proper Linux computer.
So you're not giving this one to me then?
I'm afraid not, no.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. I was struggling searching through Kickstarter and Indiegogo for something, and I accepted this one's gone.
And Paddy, you followed on from that, very much tacked on the end, saying that it'll be realised that convergence on hardware devices is irrelevant and outmoded by software. As in, it's more about just having the applications work on different devices seamlessly and having your data kind of sync across. And I don't think that's a win, really. We're getting towards that view, but we're still not there yet, I don't think.
It's funny because when we were going through the news and you were talking about the Microsoft convergence, which I've forgotten the name of.
Continuum.
Yes, Continuum. And the fact that had sort of lost the limelight made me think, oh, I wonder if Paddy's prediction is a win there. But you're going to argue that no, Joe?
I don't think that this year it's really on people's minds. I think that maybe next year we might get to that stage, but I don't think there's been enough of it to become kind of mainstream this year.
Yeah, I wonder also if there's still too many software players in the marketplace, because for this sort of convergence to happen, you need either a lot of openness, and a lot of players aren't interested in openness, or you need near monopoly positions where, because you're using the same people's software and operating system across devices, it makes that transition very easy, and there is very little syncing going on in effect because everything's up in somebody's cloud. So perhaps it's a function of the fact that we have some variety of vendors out there that this hasn't actually taken off as much as I thought it would. But anyway, when we think about the mobile space, we mentioned earlier some of the variety has been lost in the shape of Firefox OS. But Tizen still seems to be kicking around, and that was actually Joe's next prediction, where he said Tizen will continue to do well in some markets, but then it went on to talk about Ubuntu and said that Ubuntu will release another phone and a convergence device. Firefox OS and Sailfish will effectively die.
With no new phones or tablets. So some of that was right, I think. Ubuntu did release another phone and a convergence device. Firefox OS did die. And Tizen, did that continue to do well?
Yeah, I think it has. The Z2's just had another update, and it's doing great guns around the bricks.
But Sailfish, I'm afraid I was completely wrong, wasn't I?
Yeah, but that's only come at the very, very end of 2016. You are so close. And we're counting the fact that the Russian government is looking at using Sailfish as their sort of official and approved operating system for mobile, which has obviously put a whole load of push behind Sailfish and the guys at Yolla. So they were looking on the brink, and you almost got all of this, but Sailfish seems to have, had another push.
I could be wrong. I seem to remember there was a phone come out in India, middle of the year, that was also running Sailfish.
Aquafish?
Vague bells.
Aquafish is a smartphone that runs Sailfish, released in July 2016, costing RS 5,000. Is that rupees?
Yep, sounds like Paddy was absolutely right on middle of the year and India.
Well done, Paddy. Yes, so I was totally wrong, basically, about Sailfish, which I'm pleased about because I don't want that to die. I think that it is, it's got real potential. I think that it's better than Ubuntu, I'm afraid, and that for a Linux-based mobile operating system, you've got Android and Sailfish. They're the only two real sort of options as far as I'm concerned.
I think what's striking with Sailfish, apart from the mismanagement of the company, which almost saw them go bust right at the beginning of last year, as far as I remember, is the amount of resources that they each have. I mean, Canonical, obviously, are putting an awful lot into their convergence efforts and developing Ubuntu Touch. And you contrast that with the number of people working on Sailfish, and I don't know, it certainly informs my opinion of how poorly Ubuntu Touch has developed.
Well, let's not bash Canonical too much on our Christmas show, eh?
Well, even though 1604 wireless still drops me out every 5 minutes, that's getting very annoying.
Well, I had to fix someone's disappearing mouse, and my solution was to upgrade them from 1404 to 1604, and that worked perfectly. So, hit and miss, I suppose, is the word.
Okay, well, we move on to the next prediction, and as it's the last show, we can maybe be a little bit more candid about the demise of the Pi podcast. Now, I don't want to, lay out any secrets, but basically I think what happened is that Joe saw the potential for my prediction to come true and thought we'd better end the podcast before Jesse's prediction comes true, because my next prediction was that the Pi podcast would review Mycroft running on the Pi, which was a double prediction of both Mycroft being released on the Pi and then Joe having to review it, and in doing so, make me right and be correct. And what he did was pull the plug on the Pi podcast to get around this problem. Is that true, Joe?
That is 100% true, Jesse. Yeah, of course. That's the whole story.
So I think, unfortunately, this has not come true. Even if we ignore the Pi podcast bit, which is, an entirely different part, the Mycroft has not been released on the Pi officially.
Well, you can run it on the Pi yourself. It is a bit of a pain to get running, but you can do it. And there were people doing it at sort of middle of the year, I think. So you could almost claim this as a win. Although it's not the official final version of it, there was a development version that you could run and we could have reviewed.
I appreciate your kindness in offering me that, but I think the sort of push behind this was that I really expected Mycroft to be a lot further forward than it is at the end of 2016. I was expecting it to be out and available. You could chuck it on a Pi. There'd maybe be a snap for it, heaven forbid, all these sorts of things. And it just seems to be still under development, and the Kickstarter or Indiegogo, the crowdfunding campaign for it, hasn't been delivered yet. And I feel, I was taking the mickey a little bit about the Pi podcast reviewing it, but it's more about where Mycroft should be, and it isn't where I predicted it would be.
Yeah, this was something Popey flagged up. Last show, I talked about how it surely isn't that hard. All it is a Raspberry Pi in a box with a speaker and a microphone. There is actually another control board in there, apparently, which I didn't know about and should have known about. And so thank you, Popey, for flagging that up. I was wrong about that. But it seems to be a case of they should have been able to deliver this by now, surely. But hopefully for the backers of Kickstarter and Indiegogo, they ran 2 campaigns, remember, they will deliver that early next year. So we'll see about that.
Yes, and let's totally ignore Ryan Sipes' jumping ship.
Yes.
Yeah, didn't bode well, did it?
No.
Anyhow, back to our friends at Canonical, who seems to be getting an undue amount of airtime this episode. And you, Joe, suggested that they wouldn't be bought or go public. And that was at a time of year when there was a fair amount of speculation, including, I think, from some of the people at Canonical, about Amazon buying them or an IPO happening.
Yeah, and sure enough, I was totally right, wasn't I? It's still a private company and just 100% win. Yes. Which brings us to, I think, a win for you, Paddy, which you said BTreeFS won't gain widespread adoption, but ZFS will.
I suspect I probably actually said ButterFS, because nobody says BTreeFS apart from Wimpy.
No, that started from Linux Voice. It was Ben on Linux Voice who raised the point that that's what it actually is, and it's as easy to say BTreeFS as it is ButterFS. So that's why I've been sticking with that since.
Okay, so the ZFS bit, what does ZFS stand for, and why don't you use that?
It's the Z file system, isn't it?
I don't know what it stands for. Don't embarrass me in public.
Well, I'll take the win quite happily. ButterFS continues to have issues. It seems barely a week goes by without reading a story about some bug or other that causes huge problems, and the devs saying, "Oh, it's just features you're not supposed to use," but nobody compiles them out. So, and ZFS, as we mentioned earlier, having got rolled into 1604, is become part of the landscape, really.
Yeah, even talk, I believe, of ZFS getting into Debian as well, maybe as an add-on after you've installed. But I agree, this is a clear win. No one's installing ButterFS apart from on SUSE, which it already had at the end of 2015 anyway, and so as default. And like you say, ZFS we covered in the news being available on Ubuntu. There's no two ways about it. It's a solid win for Paddy.
Originally Zettabyte file system, but now just ZFS. It doesn't actually stand for anything anymore. So I don't have to be too embarrassed for not knowing what it stood for. Whew. But yeah, win for Paddy there, I think. So Jesse, LibreOffice will produce Android and desktop collaborative editing apps.
I haven't seen them.
No.
Have either of you?
No, I haven't seen them, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I was surprised. I felt that there was a push towards the end of 2015 for LibreOffice to move into Android. And, really what we're doing is using Google products because they're a collaborative way of using them. A lot of people, I think, use Google Drive docs as show notes and to chat with friends and all these sorts of things, and have somewhere you can put all this information. And even if you're just using it on your own, you can use it at home on the go, when you log into your Android phone and what have you. Convergence,
as Paddy was talking about.
Was the software convergence, absolutely. But the point is that we had that at the end of 2015 anyway, so I'm not quite sure how we've come that much. I don't think we've come that much further forwards in 2016. But I really thought that LibreOffice would see that this is where things are going and decide that this is somewhere they should be. But it hasn't happened, and I don't think there is a suitable Android or even free and open source version of a collaborative editing suite.
You know where they've been directing all the development effort?
If it's not translations, I haven't heard of it.
Well, available in the coming release is a ribbon. So instead of menus, you'll be able to use a ribbon just like you can in Microsoft Office.
Oh, thank God they're catching up. They'll be up with Office 2013 eventually.
Yeah. Don't sweat the small stuff, guys. Anyhow, moving it on. And the last prediction from last time out was one from Joe. And he said there wouldn't be an i3, i5 or i7 laptop. And I think he probably had purism in mind here, that runs totally free software right down to the BIOS.
Yeah, BIOS, EFI, whatever you want to call it. And that was such an obvious thing that I really shouldn't claim it as a win, I don't think, because there was just no way that was possible. You can't have a high-end Intel chip running totally free software. And I suppose the idea was that at the time, purism were talking about negotiating with Intel to get that code freed, but there was just no way they were going to do that. And now they have kind of pivoted, haven't they, more towards privacy issues rather than totally free software. And yeah, you might be able to run everything from the BIOS up as free software, but you've been able to do that on other machines as well, ThinkPads and stuff, if you get the right wireless card. I mean, I've got 2 machines that run Triskel, 3 machines that run Triskel perfectly well, except for the wireless card, which I know you can buy one that is free software friendly. So I just think we're in the same position that we were, that you're not going to get a high-end Intel machine running a free BIOS, basically.
You're not even going to get a low-end one, to be honest, because ARM isn't particularly open, is it? I think the only hope for the future here is RISC-V, which we've been talking about.
I think you're right, but that seems a long way in the future before you're going to be able to get a laptop that is going to be able to do serious productive work. Right, so appearing before me in this doc is Paddy 2, Jesse 1, and Joe 3.5. So does that mean I have won?
I don't think there was an even number of predictions there, was there?
I think so.
There was 4 each.
1, 2, 3.
How did I get 3.5 then?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that your Tizen one was a full win. The one that said Tizen will continue to do well in some markets, Ubuntu will release another phone and a convergence device, Firefox OS and Sailfish will effectively die. What you've done there is said about 5 predictions in one, some of which came true, some of which didn't, and so I've given you a half.
Okay.
So you've got 3.5.
But didn't I get 1 point taken off at one point for something?
Excellent. Right, we'll give you 2.5. Good plan.
Well, I still win, so I don't really care. So by the narrowest of margins, I come out on top. Yes. Unless Paddy's going to dispute that, is he?
No, I'll let you have it.
Yes, I'm the winner.
Happy Christmas, mate.
Yes. And so on that bombshell, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites, and indeed the end of Linux Luddites. You can still email us for a while at show@linuxluddites.com, and we're still on Twitter at Linux Luddites. I think I'm going to steal that for Late Night Linux, if you don't mind, Paddy. I might just change the username if you can still do that. And we've still got the Google Plus and Facebook communities, and you can leave a comment on the website until you manage to turn that into a static one, Paddy. So, yes, thank you for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We will never see you again on this show. And yeah, Paddy, thank you, man, is all I can say for 3 and a bit years. We started this show together. It was all the richer for Jesse coming along, but there would have been no show without you, Paddy, and in your absence, there will be no show. But the show must go on, and that's why we're changing it to Late Night Linux. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Paddy, Jesse, and everyone who's ever listened. And see you on the new show.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye.
See you later, Luddites.